The German artillerymen thought they were masters of the battlefield, their powerful guns unmatched. They were wrong. In the winter of 1941, a new sound filled the air, a demonic howl that signaled a firestorm from the heavens. Before they could even understand what was happening, their world was turned to ash by a weapon that struck and vanished like a phantom. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The vast frozen steppe of late 1941 was a kingdom of gray and white under an oppressive sky that promised only more cold. Here, on the edge of the world, Hauptmann Klaus Richter commanded his artillery battery with the unwavering confidence of a man who believed in the supremacy of German engineering and the elegant mathematics of warfare. His world was one of precise calculations, of ballistic arcs and firing solutions. A deadly chess match played across kilometers of frozen earth. His pieces were the formidable 10.5 centimeter LEFH-18 howitzers, their long barrels pointing east, a source of immense professional pride and a symbol of the order he imposed upon the chaos of the front. The ground, hard with permafrost, crunched under the hobnailed boots of his men, their breath misting in the frigid air as they moved with practiced efficiency, the metallic scent of gun oil, a constant, reassuring perfume. Klaus, a man in his late 30s with sharp features and an even sharper mind, stood over a map table inside his command dugout. The lines and symbols were a language he understood intimately. He traced a finger along a plotted enemy position, a faint smile touching his lips. "Their patterns are sloppy, predictable," he announced to his second-in-command, who stood hunched near the brazier, trying to coax some warmth into his gnarled fingers. "We have them ranged. Another week, and we'll be shelling the outskirts of Moscow." Feldwebel Lars, a grizzled veteran whose face was a roadmap of past conflicts, squinted out the dugout's narrow opening towards the unending horizon. His optimism, unlike the Hauptmann's, had been worn thin by the attrition of the First World War and the brutal years that followed. He had a sixth sense for danger, a primal instinct for survival that had little to do with maps or mathematics. "Perhaps, Hauptmann," he rumbled, his voice low and gravelly, "but this land, it has a way of swallowing armies, and their silence is unsettling." Klaus dismissed the comment with a wave of his hand. He respected Lars's experience, but he found the old soldier's cynicism to be a relic of a bygone era of warfare. This was a new age, an age of blitzkrieg, of overwhelming force applied with scientific precision. The Soviets were, in his estimation, a disorganized rabble, their equipment crude, their tactics born of desperation. The distant rumbling echo of their own guns firing on a schedule was proof of their dominance. It was the sound of order, of control. Lars's unease was simply the product of an old man's superstition, a fear of the unknown vastness of the landscape itself. Klaus felt a deep, satisfying sense of professional pride. His men were the best, his guns were the best, and their victory was not a matter of if, but when. He was a master of his craft, and the board was set for his final, decisive moves. The silence from the enemy was not unsettling, it was the sound of their impending collapse. That perception, that entire worldview, was annihilated in the space of a single heartbeat. It began without any warning, no distant drone of aircraft, no telltale whistle of an incoming shell. It was a sound utterly alien to the battlefield, a terrifying, high-pitched shriek that tore through the air, climbing in intensity until it became a deafening, demonic roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once. For a frozen moment, every man in the German position looked up, their faces a mixture of confusion and primal fear. The sky itself seemed to be screaming. Then the heavens opened and rained fire. A storm of rockets, dozens of them, descended in a chaotic, unguided torrent. This was not the precise surgical strike of a single artillery piece. It was a saturation, an act of pure, overwhelming violence. The ground shook as if in the grip of a furious earthquake. Explosions ripped through the well-fortified positions with contemptuous ease. A howitzer, a monument of Krupp steel weighing thousands of pounds, was flipped onto its back like a child's toy, its barrel twisted into a grotesque sculpture of defeat. Stacks of ammunition ignited in a chain reaction of secondary blasts. sending geysers of fire and shrapnel tearing through the camp. The air, once biting cold, became a superheated wave of pressure and force, throwing bodies through the air like rag dolls. The neat, orderly world of Hauptmann Klaus Richter was turned to ash and ruin in less than 60 seconds. Klaus was thrown from his feet, the map table splintering beneath him as the dugout's timbers groaned and cracked. The world dissolved into a cacophony of noise, the unearthly scream of the rockets blending with the thunder of their impact and the very human screams of his men. His ears rang with a piercing tone, his mind struggling to process the impossible sensory input. He tasted dirt and cordite. He felt a searing heat on his face and a sharp stabbing pain in his shoulder. The neat columns of his calculations, the elegant arcs of his ballistic charts, were erased by a brutal, terrifying new equation. The chaos was absolute, a physical manifestation of madness descending from a cold, gray sky. He had believed warfare was a science, but this was something else entirely. This was an apocalypse. And then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. An eerie, profound silence fell over the position, broken only by the hungry crackle of spreading fires and the low, agonized moans of the wounded and the dying. The world smelled of burning earth and cooked meat. Klaus pushed himself to his knees, his head swimming. A warm wetness seeped through the shoulder of his greatcoat, and when he touched it, his fingers came away slick with blood. Shaking, he stumbled out of the ruined dugout and into the nightmare that had been his command. The devastation was total. Where his proud guns had once stood in perfect alignment, there were now only smoking craters and twisted, blackened metal. The bodies of his men lay scattered amidst the wreckage, their gray uniforms stained dark red. He saw Feldwebel Lars, his face a grim mask of soot, dragging a screaming soldier away from a burning supply truck. The old veteran moved with a grim purpose, his earlier unease now replaced by the focused energy of a survivor. Klaus staggered towards him, his voice a hoarse croak. What was that? Air attack? He looked to the sky, but it was empty, impassive. But there was no sound of planes. Lars looked at him, his eyes reflecting the orange glow of the flames. No, Hauptmann, he said, his voice heavy with a terrible certainty. That was artillery, but not like any I've ever seen, or heard. The professional soldier in Klaus, buried for a moment under the shock and terror, clawed its way back to the surface. His mind, though dazed, raced. Artillery. It had to be. But the volume, the speed, the sheer destructive power, it defied all known logic of conventional gunnery. A cold, professional fury began to replace his fear. He had been violated. His science had been mocked by this brutal, chaotic force. Counter battery, he rasped, grabbing the arm of a nearby soldier who was staring blankly at the carnage. Get to the spotters. I want coordinates. Muzzle flashes, smoke plumes, anything. The order was given, a small island of military procedure in an ocean of chaos. The surviving NCOs began to rally the men, organizing makeshift aid stations and firefighting parties. Klaus stood amidst the wreckage, his mind a whirlwind. He had been hit, but he barely felt the shrapnel in his shoulder. The wound to his pride, to his entire understanding of his profession, was far deeper. This was a personal affront. Minutes later, a shaken spotter ran up to him, his face pale. Hauptmann, nothing. We saw nothing. What do you mean, nothing? Klaus demanded, grabbing the man by the collar. A barrage like that, there must have been 100 guns. The flashes would have lit up the horizon. No, sir, the spotter stammered, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. There were no muzzle flashes, not like a howitzer. We saw, just for a second, faint trails of smoke from over there. He pointed vaguely towards a distant line of trees miles away. But they were gone almost immediately. There's nothing there now. No guns, no smoke, nothing. It's like they were ghosts. Ghosts. The word hung in the acrid air. Klaus let the man go, his mind reeling with the implications. An artillery barrage with no discernible launch point. A weapon that could unleash a firestorm and then simply vanish. It was impossible. It defied the known rules of engagement, the very physics of ballistics as he knew them. He looked around at the terrified faces of his surviving men, huddled together, whispering. He could already hear the legend being born in those hushed, fearful tones. A name for the demonic sound they had all heard. Stalin's organ, one man muttered, and the name spread like the fires that still consumed their camp. Klaus looked out at the vast, empty steppe, the low, mournful wind sweeping across it, carrying the scent of death. Lars had been right. This land had a way of swallowing armies, and now it had birthed a monster. His world of predictable patterns and precise calculations had been shattered. He was no longer playing chess. He was hunting a phantom, a ghost that rode the wind and rained fire from an empty sky. The game had changed, and he, for the first time in his career, did not know the rules. A few weeks later, the war had found a new, maddening rhythm. The German command bunker, a cramped subterranean space reeking of stale cigar smoke and anxiety, had become Klaus Richter's entire world. The walls were a chaotic tapestry of maps, each one pockmarked with red circles indicating the latest phantom strikes. Reports flooded in from across the front, a litany of disruption and terror. Supply convoys vaporized on open roads, infantry battalions pinned down by sudden firestorms. Artillery batteries silenced before they could even calculate a response. The physical damage was significant, but the psychological poison was proving far more potent. German forces, once defined by their aggressive confidence, were becoming jumpy, their morale eroding with every unearthly shriek from the sky. The ghost guns were everywhere and nowhere. Klaus, thinner now, with a feverish intensity in his eyes, stood before the central map. The shrapnel wound in his shoulder was a dull, persistent ache, a physical anchor to the intellectual obsession that now consumed him. He spent his days and nights poring over the strike data, searching for a pattern, a signature, a mistake. He was no longer just an artillery officer. He was a man possessed, determined to dissect this new form of warfare and lay its secrets bare. The bunker door scraped open, and Oberst Brandt entered, his face a thundercloud. Brandt was a senior officer of the old school, a pragmatist whose career was being slowly strangled by the pressure from high command to find a solution to the guards' mortars. He slapped a fresh report down on the table, his fist connecting with the wood with a sharp crack that made a junior officer flinch. "Another one," Brandt growled, his voice thick with frustration. "A fuel depot near Smolensk, gone. They fire and they vanish. Our counter battery is useless. We are firing at ghosts, Richter. Ghosts!" He began to pace the narrow confines of the room. "High command wants answers. They are calling it cowardice, hiding behind these toys. They cannot comprehend a weapon that doesn't stand and fight." Klaus didn't look up from the map. He took a grease pencil and drew a new red circle, connecting it with a faint line to previous strikes. "It's not cowardice, Herr Oberst," he said, his voice quiet but firm, cutting through the colonel's tirade. "It's tactics, and they are brilliant." He finally turned, his eyes burning with a cold fire. He pointed a finger at the web of lines on the map. "Look, they are not random. They follow the roads, the railways. They are mobile, fluid. We are static, anchored to our guns and our fortifications. We are waiting to be hit. We need to think like them. We need to become hunters, not duelists." Brandt stopped pacing and stared at him, a flicker of something, perhaps grudging respect, in his eyes. The Wehrmacht's entire artillery doctrine was built on the concept of the duel, of superior guns and superior gunners systematically destroying their counterparts. Klaus was suggesting they abandon the core of their training, their very identity. It was heresy. But it was also the first new idea Brandt had heard in weeks. The frustration in the command bunker was palpable, a toxic mix of anger and a growing unspoken sense of helplessness. Klaus's obsession, however unsettling, was a beacon of purpose in that fog of despair. He was determined to solve the intellectual puzzle of the Katyusha, not just for victory, but to restore the logical, ordered world of warfare he so desperately believed in. Deep within a sprawling forest of pine and birch, miles from the front, the ghosts were refueling. The air, thick with the scent of pine needles and diesel, was filled with the clang of metal and the low, urgent murmurs of men at work. Here, hidden under a dense canopy that shielded them from the prying eyes of German reconnaissance planes, was the makeshift camp of a guards' mortar battery. A half-dozen American-made Studebaker trucks, their olive drab paint camouflaged with streaks of mud and foliage, were parked in a clearing. Their flatbeds were not laden with supplies, but with the stark skeletal frames of steel launch rails, angled towards the sky like a strange metallic prayer. Sergeant Dmitry Volkov, the commander of this particular battery, moved between the trucks with a restless energy. He was young, barely into his 20s, with a fierce patriotic fire in his eyes that had been forged not in a military academy, but in the steel mills of Moscow. He was not a traditional soldier, but he was a master of his weapon. Proud of the roaring fire it sent towards the fascist invaders, his crew, a tight-knit group of men drawn from factories and farms across the Union, worked with a practiced, almost frantic efficiency. They were bound by the shared danger of their missions, by the knowledge that their survival depended entirely on speed. They were a spear tip, thrown at the enemy, and their only defense was to vanish before the enemy could strike back. "Quickly, comrades, quickly!" Dmitri urged, clapping a reloader on the back. "The fascists will be searching the skies for us. We give them fire, then we give them dust, for the motherland." His men responded with grim nods, their movements economical and swift. They hoisted the long, finned rockets from their wooden crates and slid them onto the launch rails, the metal clattering in the quiet forest. They passed a shared flask of rough vodka, the fiery liquid a small comfort against the ever-present chill and the gnawing tension in their guts. They were not just soldiers, they were avengers. They were the answer to the German technological superiority, the embodiment of a revolutionary fervor that turned truck drivers and factory workers into the most feared artillerymen on the Eastern Front. In a separate command truck parked deeper in the woods, a young woman named Anya Petrova leaned over a crackling radio set, a headset pressed to one ear. Her face was calm, her expression focused, a stark contrast to the barely controlled chaos outside. As the battery's spotter and radio operator, she was the brain to Dmitri's brawn. It was her sharp eyes and steady hand that translated reconnaissance reports into the precise coordinates that would guide the coming storm. She was resilient, a survivor of the siege of Leningrad, and she provided the calm, firm center around which the entire unit revolved. The radio crackled to life with a burst of static, followed by a coded message from a forward observation post. Anya scribbled furiously on a notepad, her brow furrowed in concentration. After a moment, she looked up and keyed her own microphone. Her voice, when it came, was clear and steady, cutting through the nervous energy of the camp. "Position confirmed, Sergeant," she broadcast to the receiver in Dmitri's truck. "Target is a German supply depot. They are refueling tanks for a morning assault." A small, grim smile touched her lips. "Let's warm them up." Dmitri heard the message and grinned, a flash of white teeth in his grimy face. He vaulted onto the running board of his truck, his voice booming across the clearing. "You heard her, boys. The Panzers are thirsty. Let's give them a drink of fire." A ragged cheer went up from the men. The tension that had held them in its grip was broken, replaced by a surge of adrenaline and grim purpose. They were living on borrowed time, but in these moments just before the storm, they felt invincible. Klaus's new strategy was a monumental gamble. For days he had ignored the scattered, opportunistic strikes, focusing instead on the larger picture, the logistical arteries of the German war machine. He had plotted every major Katyusha attack on his map, and a terrifyingly logical pattern had emerged. The ghost guns were not just spreading terror, they were systematically strangling the Wehrmacht's ability to fight. They hit fuel dumps, ammunition stores, and transportation hubs with uncanny prescience. And as Klaus traced the lines of their recent attacks, his eyes were drawn to one critical, as yet untouched target, a key railway bridge spanning the Dnieper River. It was the primary conduit for supplies and reinforcements to the entire Central Front. Instead of heavily fortifying the bridge, which would only make it a more tempting target, Klaus planned to use it as bait. He was going to set a trap. The plan was audacious, bordering on insane. He requested and, after a furious argument with a skeptical Oberst Brandt, received temporary command of 3 additional artillery batteries. He was pulling these guns from active sectors of the front, leaving them dangerously exposed, all for the chance to catch a single phantom unit. His career, and Brandt's, was now staked on this one, desperate roll of the dice. Under the cover of darkness, Klaus's men worked silently, repositioning their howitzers not around the bridge, but in a wide, sweeping arc several kilometers away, hidden in scattered woods and deep ravines. His own spotters were deployed even further out, miles from the guns, with a single, crucial mission. They were not to look for the bridge, but to stare into the empty darkness of the surrounding countryside, waiting for the faint, brief signature of a rocket launch. As the last gun was set in place, Feldwebel Lars approached Klaus, his silhouette a dark, hunched shape against the pale moonlight. The old soldier's face was etched with worry. "This is a big risk, Hauptmann," he said, his voice a low rumble. "A very big risk. If they hit somewhere else, if your prediction is wrong, the blood of those men in the sectors we stripped will be on our hands." Klaus stood on a small rise, his binoculars trained on the distant skeletal outline of the bridge. The air was cold and still, the usual rumble of the front line, a muted, faraway pulse. "It is a calculated risk, Lars," he replied, his voice devoid of emotion. He was operating now in a realm of pure intellect, of probability and psychology. They are creatures of habit, driven by logistical priorities. They are methodical. They will come for the bridge. It is the next logical move in their campaign. He lowered the binoculars and looked at his old sergeant, his eyes glinting in the darkness. "And when they do, we will be waiting." The silence that followed was thick with suspense. The German gun crews waited in their hidden positions, a nervous tension gripping them. They were hunters now, as the Hauptmann had said, but they were hunting a monster they had never seen. Klaus felt the immense weight of his decision pressing down on him. He had staked everything on his ability to outthink an enemy he was only just beginning to understand. He was operating on a knife's edge between genius and madness, waiting for the tell-tale shriek in the night, the sound that would signal either his triumph or his ruin. The air was cold, the moon was hidden by a veil of high clouds, and for the first time in a long time, the night was utterly, terrifyingly quiet. The silence of the night was a taut string, pulled to its breaking point. For Klaus, it was the silence of the predator, the perfect, breathless moment before the pounce. For Dmitry Volkov and his men, it was the silence of the thief, the precious seconds of darkness needed to steal a life from the invaders. Anya's voice, crisp and clear over the radio, was the spark that ignited the fuse. "Target confirmed, comrades. The railway bridge. Logistical priority 1. You have 7 minutes from first movement. Godspeed." Dimitri's battery, which had been waiting in the deep woods 5 kilometers from their firing point, roared to life. The Studebaker engines, well, maintained and powerful, growled in the darkness as the trucks lurched onto a hidden track. They moved with a practiced choreography of violence, each driver knowing his place, each man in the back bracing himself against the rough ride. They were a spectral convoy, their headlights off, navigating by moonlight and memory. They burst from the woods into a wide, fallow field, the designated launch site. It was dangerously open, but offered the perfect, unobstructed line of fire towards the distant bridge. "Positions!" Dmitry yelled, his truck skidding to a halt precisely on its mark. The other 5 vehicles fanned out beside him. The crew swarmed out, their movements a blur of frantic efficiency. Hand cranks squealed as the launch rails were elevated, the long rockets pointing their noses to the sky. The entire process took less than 3 minutes. They were exposed, vulnerable, a perfect target. But for these few moments, they were the most dangerous thing on the Eastern Front. "Fire!" Dmitry bellowed. The world answered with a scream. The first rocket ignited with a tremendous whoosh, leaping from its rail on a tail of brilliant orange fire. In a deafening, rolling cascade, the others followed, dozens of projectiles clawing their way into the night sky. Their combined shriek the sound of tearing fabric, of a world being ripped apart. They were a swarm of incandescent hornets, a promise of fiery death, arcing gracefully towards the unsuspecting bridge. Miles away, in a camouflaged observation post, a young German spotter screamed into his microphone, his voice cracking with a mixture of terror and elation. "Launch detected! Launch detected! Sector Gamma, 7, faint smoke trail. They are there. They are there." The coordinates flooded Klaus's command post. The raw data was instantly translated into firing solutions by his waiting crews. This was the moment, the culmination of weeks of obsession, of sleepless nights and cold fury. Klaus lifted his own microphone, his knuckles white. His voice, when he spoke, was the chillingly calm center of the storm he was about to unleash. "All batteries, on my command," he said, the words clipped and precise. "Fire for effect. Erase them." Across a 10-kilometer arc, the German howitzers spoke as one. Their thunderous roar was a deep, guttural contrast to the high-pitched scream of the rockets. For the first time since the Phantom attacks began, German counter-battery fire was not a hopeful guess. It was a targeted, immediate, and overwhelming response. For Dmitri's crew, the sound of their own rockets was still echoing in their ears when a new sound arrived, a terrifying chorus of whistles from above. Dmitri's head snapped up. His blood ran cold. It was the sound of incoming shells. So soon. It was impossible. Before he could even form a coherent thought, the world erupted. The first German shells walked their way across the field, great gouts of earth and shrapnel exploding in the darkness. Then they found their mark. A shell landed directly between two of the Studebaker trucks. One of them, its rocket rails now empty, was simply obliterated. The fuel tank ignited in a blinding white-hot flash, and the vehicle disappeared in a massive fireball that lit up the entire countryside, turning night into a momentary, hellish day. The second truck was lifted into the air and torn in half, its frame twisting like wire. The shockwave hit Dmitri like a physical blow, knocking him off his feet. The triumphant roar of his rockets was replaced by the screams of his men. The trap had been sprung. He scrambled to his feet, his ears ringing, his mind screaming one word: survive. "Go!" he shrieked, his voice raw with desperation. "Drive! Scatter! Get out of the kill zone! Go! Go! Now!" In her command vehicle, hidden a kilometer away, Anya watched in horror as the clearing where her friends had been just seconds before became a churning cauldron of fire and explosions. The radio link to the truck that had just vanished went dead, the sudden silence more terrifying than any scream. She saw the remaining trucks, their silhouettes stark against the flames, begin to move, scattering like panicked animals as German shells continued to rain down upon them. The hunter had become the hunted, and the cost was being paid in the blood of her comrades. Dmitri hauled himself into the driver's seat of his truck, the engine miraculously still running. He slammed it into gear, the tires spinning in the churned-up earth before finding purchase. He didn't look back. He couldn't. He wrestled with the wheel, careening into the relative safety of the forest, the whistle of incoming shells a constant terrifying accompaniment. Branches scraped and clawed at the truck, the impacts sounding like gunshots against the metal. Trees splintered and fell as shells chased them, the forest floor erupting around them. He could feel the heat from the burning wreckage on the back of his neck, a funeral pyre for the men he had led into this ambush. He burst through the far side of the woods and onto a dirt road, his foot still pressed to the floor. He risked a glance in his rearview mirror. Behind him, another Studebaker, its chassis riddled with shrapnel, followed, its driver a pale, grim face in the dashboard lights. One other, out of 6. He kept driving, pushing the engine until it screamed, putting as much distance as possible between his surviving men and the perfectly executed trap. Only when the sound of the explosions had faded to a distant, angry rumble did he finally allow himself to slow down. He pulled over into a thicket of birch trees, the silver bark seeming to glow in the darkness. The other truck pulled in beside him. The silence that descended was heavy, suffocating. Dmitri rested his forehead against the steering wheel, his body trembling with a mixture of adrenaline and shock. He had survived, but the victory was ashes in his mouth. He got out of the truck, his legs unsteady. The other driver and the 2 surviving crewmen from the second vehicle stumbled towards him. 4 of them, out of a battery of more than 20 men. He looked back in the direction of the fire, a distant flickering orange stain against the dark sky. The rage came then, a hot, blinding fury that burned away the fear. It was a rage directed at the Germans, at their cunning, but also at himself, for his confidence, for his belief in their own invincibility. He had been so proud of their phantom status, so sure of their ability to strike and vanish. But tonight, the Germans had learned to hunt ghosts. Grief followed the rage. A cold, heavy stone in his gut. He thought of the men he had shared vodka with just an hour before, their faces lit by the dim light of the forest camp. Now they were gone, consumed by the fire he had led them into. But beneath the grief and the rage, something else was hardening, crystallizing into a new, cold resolve. He had survived, and he would fight again. He would learn from this. They would become faster, more unpredictable. They would honor their dead by raining even more fire upon the enemy. Back at the German command post, a grim satisfaction settled over Klaus. The reports confirmed it. At least 3, possibly 4 launchers destroyed. A significant victory. He had proven his theory. He had met the ghost and drawn its blood. Oberst Brandt was ecstatic, clapping him on the back and promising commendations. But as Klaus stood on the rise overlooking the distant fires, he felt a strange hollowness, a sense of victory that was both profound and utterly meaningless. He had won the duel, but he had not defeated the weapon. He had sacrificed the safety of entire sectors, gambled the lives of hundreds of men, all to destroy a handful of trucks, and 2 had still escaped. The resources required for his trap were immense, unsustainable. He could not lay such a trap for every bridge, every supply depot on the entire Eastern Front. He had proven they could be located, that they could be destroyed. But he had also proven how incredibly fleeting they were. The ghost remained at large. He looked out into the vast, dark expanse of Russia and understood with a chilling clarity that he was no longer a master of a science. He was a man trying to build a dam against a flood, one sandbag at a time. The war of elegant duels was over. This new war was one of attrition, of speed, and of sheer brutal numbers, and he had a sinking feeling that it was a war Germany was not equipped to win. 1 year later, in the late summer of 1943, the world had turned upside down. The tide of the war had not just turned, it had become a tidal wave, a relentless grinding advance of Soviet power that was pushing the Wehrmacht back towards its own borders. Klaus Richter, now an Oberstleutnant, commanded a vast artillery group, a position of immense authority that felt utterly powerless. He was no longer a hunter, he was the prey, engaged in a desperate, chaotic fighting retreat across the same plains where he had once stood so confident. His command post was a scene of barely controlled panic. The air was thick with the smell of sweat and fear. A massive Soviet offensive had shattered their lines, and the prelude to every assault was the same. It began with the familiar, deep-throated roar of thousands of conventional guns, a rolling thunder that shook the very earth, a display of raw power that was terrifying in its own right. But that was only the opening act. Then came the sound. It started as a faint, high-pitched whine on the edge of hearing and grew with terrifying speed into the demonic shriek that was now seared into the consciousness of every German soldier on the front. But this was not the sound of a single ghostly battery. This was the sound of hundreds of them. Klaus looked out from his bunker, and the sky itself seemed to be on fire. The horizon was a solid wall of flame and smoke, from which rose an unending stream of rockets, a swarm of biblical proportions. The sky was filled with their fiery trails, a canopy of death that blotted out the sun. The Katyushas were no longer a phantom menace. They were a core, integrated component of the Red Army's doctrine of deep battle, a wave of fire that moved with the tanks and the infantry. Its purpose not just to destroy, but to terrorize, to shatter the will to resist before the first soldier even crossed the line. A young soldier, his face covered in soot, his eyes wide and vacant with shell shock, stumbled into the command post and collapsed against the wall. He looked at Klaus, his gaze unfocused, his body trembling uncontrollably. "Oberstleutnant," he stammered, his voice a thin, reedy whisper. "That sound, that awful sound, it's everywhere." Klaus looked from the soldier's terrified face to the burning world outside. His own face was a mask of profound exhaustion, every line etched with the slow, grinding agony of defeat. The obsessive fire that had once burned in his eyes was long gone, replaced by the dull, empty resignation of a man who has seen his entire world, his beliefs, his science, turned to ash. He had been so proud, so certain. He had thought warfare was a precise, mathematical discipline. He had been a fool. He placed a hand on the young soldier's shoulder, though he wasn't sure if the gesture was meant to comfort the boy or to steady himself. "Yes," Klaus said, his voice barely audible above the cataclysmic roar. "It is the sound of their victory." He paused, his gaze fixed on the horizon, where the world was ending. "We thought this was a science. We were wrong. This is a storm." The view pulled back from Klaus's weary, defeated face, out from the collapsing bunker, and over the vast, burning battlefield. As far as the eye could see, the planes were crawling with the might of the Red Army, and moving with them, a new and terrible kind of cavalry, were the truck columns. Dozens of them, hundreds of them, the skeletal launch rails on their backs pointing west, always west. On the running board of one of those Studebakers, a hardened, grim-faced Dmitry Volkov scanned the horizon, his jaw set. In his ear, a voice, calm and steady, crackled over the radio, Anya's voice, directing him to the next target, the next firestorm. The hit and run tactic of a few desperate ghosts had evolved into an unstoppable, all-consuming wave of fire. The war of fixed positions and calculated duels was a distant memory, replaced by a new, terrifying mobility that Germany never saw coming and could never hope to match.